Very happy. Yeah, that's good. Okay, welcome. So I'd like to introduce Gareth Locke. Gareth retired after 25 years in the Royal Air Force in February last year, and it was during this period that his interest in human factors in diving germinated. Having seen how military aviation learned from its mistakes, he tried to apply these processes to diving. 7 years ago, he wrote a white paper on the application of a human factors model to diving, which wasn't too well received. To improve his credibility and improve the body of his knowledge in this area, 4 years ago he enrolled on a self-funded, part-time PhD, examining the role of human factors in diving incidents at Cranfield in the UK. Last year, he recognized that there was a gap in knowledge of human factors skills in diving and created a classroom-based course and an online course to teach and coach human factors skills. He truly believes that if human error is the answer that comes back from an investigation, it is only the starting point to determine why it made sense to those involved to behave in the way that they did. His key aim is to develop a just culture within the diving community so we can continue to learn from others' mistakes and behaviors by being able to talk about those adverse events free from negative criticism. As well as being a PhD candidate, he is currently self-employed as a consulting, teaching, and providing advice on human factors and human performance, and has recently been appointed Director for Risk Management for GUE. Welcome, Gareth Locke.
Thank you. The title of this presentation, incompetent and unaware. Can you put them back up in a sec, because we're going to be a bit of audience participation for this later on as well. But intentionally a contentious title, because the immediate reaction is, no, I'm not. I'm skilled. You know, Neil was talking yesterday about bubbles. I never bubble, therefore I don't get bent. You know, we don't understand our own limitations, and Simon talked about it this morning with the Dunning-Kruger Effect, which is the key theme for this. One of the problems we have is that we judge whether or not something was good or bad based on the outcome. And I'll just show you this little clip here. Some of you may have seen it, and it takes extreme wingsuit flying to the limits, really.
Largo forse sia cosa? Sarà 2 metri, 2 metri e mezzo, 2 metri
2.6 meters
60,
wide.
70.
Now the reason why I say outcome biased, what would have been your view if he'd gone splat in the cliffside?
Dumbass.
Yep. And so when we see diving accidents, you go, dumbass. People don't intentionally go out there to kill themselves. We do have a bit of self-preservation that goes on. The other difficulty is that we've got hindsight bias, and I'm going to ask some questions as we go through this. If you've seen it before, don't speak up. Okay, shouting out from the floor, what do you think is going to happen? Any ideas? It's going to swing into it, might roll away. Anything else? 3 guys going to get crushed. Everything is going to come out fine because that's what they think. What's the big consensus at the moment? What do you think?
Gravity wins.
Gravity wins? Okay, if you were involved in that, who would have thought to put the brakes on the digger?
I would have been sitting in it.
That's not unexpected, Richard. And the problem is that, as it says here, what you see is all there is. At that time, you've only got the information that's in front of you. When you know the outcome, you can look back and go, oh, it was obvious. Why didn't they do that? And there are a couple of comments yesterday of, you should have, you could have, those sorts of issues. And we would look at accidents and we read the analysis and you can just look at this and go, why didn't he spot it? And a lot of the time, they don't realise what the knock-on effects are going to be. Because part of the thing is we don't talk about the accidents that happen. And actually, we don't talk about the good things that happen as well. Michael's, Aquacore was brilliant. Some really good stories that came out there. And you could look at this and look at the context and you can see the story and go, right, I'm not going to be like that. It's a very small community in those days. People knew each other. And it became very real. Now, we've got a massive global market that's in effect driven by litigation when it comes to talking about accidents. How many people here have had something that's gone wrong on a dive? Run out of gas? Okay. How many people have talked about it in a manner that other people could learn outside of your immediate circle? In a public forum, it's a bit more difficult. Because what happens is people start throwing rocks at each other for being stupid. How could you do that? And that's my point in trying to get that just culture out there. We need to break down those barriers so that we can talk about the mistakes that we all make and recognize that we're all human. And as Simon said this morning, from James Reason's quotes, everybody makes mistakes. There is no such thing as a perfect person. Aviation's learned because we recognize that we are going to fail. And when you get down to a debrief and you talk through, you go, okay, what worked, what didn't work, and why didn't it work? When you're diving, how often do you think that it's going to fail? You don't. Because the last time you went diving, it was all fine. And Simon's presentation before lunch, and we'll cover normalization of deviance in a minute. But that's one of the things. You reinforce those behaviors when bad things don't go wrong. Right, everybody's got a pen or something in their bags. Have you got something that I want you to put in a pen, hold it in your hand, or something that you can hold and point up at the ceiling, okay? I want you to draw a big circle like this, okay? Now, move your hand down. Which direction is the circle going now? When you're up here, it's going one way. You're still doing the same thing, but the direction of the circle has changed. Your perspective has changed. What is the definition of safe? Okay. How much risk is in diving? Can you quantify it? Okay, so can you have safe in diving?
No.
Right. So when yesterday the functional safety group are talking about safety, and I know that one of the manufacturers, fail safe, to me that's marketing the wrong message. Jacob's fault tolerant, that's a much better way of doing it. There will be something that goes wrong, and the system is there to try and help you when things do go wrong. You cannot stop everything going wrong. Sometimes it's going to bite you. If you drove, hands up who drove? Well, in fact, to get here, you must have driven. How many people, or at what point did you know it was safe when you were driving? Did you consider you were safe while you were driving?
Well, I checked into my hotel.
Okay. During the drive, how did you know you were safe?
So I'm still driving.
You hadn't had an accident until you get to the other end. Now, what we found as things drift and things go wrong, you don't know that something is safe until you've finished the activity. But you could be texting, you could be distracted by something going on. You would consider that unsafe looking back, but at the time you don't think it's unsafe. So it's this recognition that things aren't as simple as they could be. There's a brilliant guy called Sidney Dekker, written a book called The Field Guide to Human Error. And in it he talks about these tubes, the retrospective or the hindsight position. This is you while you're doing your activity, and you're inside this tube. Because you're inside, you can't see what might go wrong. You're sitting there and you're doing everything, and it's not until you get to the end where something bad happens. Worse, when people look back and go, why didn't you do that? Why didn't you do this? Yesterday's commentary, he should have, he could have. Yeah, well, if you know that it's going to end up with you being dead, you're probably not going to do it. It's easy in hindsight to look back and tell the story as to why or how they could have prevented it. That doesn't help you when you're actually inside the tube and you don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So part of this leads to this issue that you don't know what you don't know. And Simon talked about it this morning, this Dunning-Kruger Effect. We overestimate our own abilities. If you think about the way that a lot of diving training happens, is positive reinforcement. Come on, Steve.
Another aspect of the Dunning-Kruger Effect is that you're so dumb you don't recognize an expert when they tell you what you're going to do.
That's cool. Me. Brilliant.
Just want to give you a bit of a boost there.
Thank you. And the last slide of this is about how much you know and how much you don't know. The very end slide. But the point here is you don't know what you don't know. You overestimate your own capabilities. It was a study with 4 areas they were looking at: humor, grammar, and logic. And any test that happens or any trial, there will be a distribution, a bell curve distribution, which is what these diagonal lines here. So you end up with bottom quarter, second, third, and fourth as part of the distribution of results across the team. When people were asked to assess their ability and how well they did in the exam, this is what they said. Broadly, 60 to 70% is what they thought they scored. And yet, those at the bottom end, 12 here, but they thought they scored 55 to 60%. These are the people that don't know what they don't know. The other side of it is the experts sit up here and they underestimate their abilities. The problem is when they deal with people who aren't as capable as them, they don't understand why they don't understand it. You look at a beginner and go, duh, why can't you do that? It's obvious how to solve that problem. But unless you've told them how it is, they're not going to know. So you've got two ends to the spectrum. You don't know what you don't know, and you don't even know how to solve that problem. So you may have seen this. If you have seen it, be quiet, please. But it's a fairly simple test to do.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball.
It's a fairly simple task. White players, basketball passes, off we go. Counting the passes, and off we go. White players,
How many passes did you count?
14. How many? Any others? Raise on this side.
The correct answer is
Okay,
15
fairly simple
passes.
task.
But did you see the gorilla?
Okay. Those who say... So there's a bunch of people here who didn't get it. Those who'd seen it, how many had actually seen the clip before? Okay. So it's really easy to miss things that go on in the background. And part of that is because of the limitations we have on situational awareness, which can be simply explained as the first stage, noticing what's there, perceiving the information. The next bit is, what does it mean to you? Thinking ahead. And then that anticipation, the projecting into the future, trying to solve that. You've got a simplistic example, somebody's swimming in front of you, the silk goes up, okay, I'm now going to carry on swimming through that, I'm going to go blind, I'm going to lose my buddy. Will change your behaviours. But if you haven't been in that situation before, you can't create this model to the future. Beginners and advanced, more experienced people can do this relatively easy. It's only through experience can you get that ability to project into the future. So this is the full model from Ensley, the situational awareness model, where you've got level 1, the ability to assess what's going on around you, the right now. What does it mean? And then the ability to look into the future. What's going on in the environment? And then you make a decision, and we'll talk about the problems of decision making in a minute. Then you do something, and then you provide some sort of feedback loop to what's going on. You do something, you notice it, and you change your behaviors. Your ability to gain situational awareness is impacted by these things. What's the system doing to help you? The display systems, your assent, your body feedback, the complexity and the automation within there. If you've got a really automatic system that's helping you out, you're not necessarily paying attention to what's going on because you're trusting the automation to help you. And this is why situational awareness is really difficult to look at as a person looking on. Your own goals and objectives and your expectations of what might happen, what the tasks are. When I gave you that task to count the passes, that was what you were looking for. You missed the gorilla because you weren't expecting it. You don't see the things that you're not expecting. Yesterday we were talking about nerds and head-up displays. There's research look at private jets, Gulfstream 5, 6s, head-up displays in the simulator, and the pilots miss the aircraft parked on the end of the runway because they're not expecting the aircraft to be there. Even though they're using the HUD and they can look through it, they're just not expecting something to be there. And why it's really important is this bit here. The abilities, the experience, and the training. So you can create a fantastic system up here to help you get situational awareness. But if you haven't got the experience or the abilities to understand what's going on and what might happen next, you will end up with rubbish decisions. Aviation's realized that as you increase the automation, your training burden actually goes up to deal with odd situations. So the Air France 447 a couple of years ago, the South Atlantic, crew unaware of what was going on around them because they hadn't had upset training. They've now put that as one of the things. And in fact, in the UK, they're looking at doing, taking pilots and putting them into aerobatic aircraft, commercial pilots, to get them experienced to upset situations. Because if you've not experienced that before, how do you know what's going on? The incident here was a rebreather guy who'd done his checklist the night before, he'd said. First dive for about 3 or 4 months, going a long way out, 25 miles off the coast of Ireland, strapped his rebreather onto the boat, and off they went. Got out to the dive site, undid the ropes holding the rebreather together, and noticed that the counterlungs were quite full. I thought, that's a bit odd. Pre-breathing, doing his final sort of 5-minute pre-breathe check before jumping in, found a lot of breathing resistance and had an issue with trying to get the set point to hold where it was. Didn't think much of it, jumped in, went down. It's like, oh, can't put any dill in, it's a bit hard to breathe. Shit, dill's empty. And the end of the end of the build checks shut down the system. He didn't turn off the dill cylinder. When he got onto the boat, strapped it in, manual add, dumping all of that. So the realization he got there is like, hang on a minute, why are the lungs full? That shouldn't be happening. Why? Rather than just accept it and go, oh, that's a bit odd, carry on. It's that comprehension of, that's not right, stop. Why is it? He then didn't do his proper checks. He didn't check how much gas you've got, even though it's part of the pre-jump check for that rebreather. So even having a checklist there, it doesn't necessarily stop things going badly wrong. This is where teams help. But you can have your own team member, situational awareness. He's got his. This is the little bit in the middle. And if you move your team members out and you don't share that information, that knowledge, you get flawed, shared situational awareness. You get the wrong decisions being taken by the team. But in some studies 3 years ago, they looked at texting in a university playground area, park area. On an individual, texting, 75% of people missed the clown who was on a unicycle cycling past them. When they had somebody who was not texting, 50% of people missed it. But when they had two people together, there's only 25% of the clowns were missed. So having a team together, having that shared idea of what's going on, helps prevent accidents from happening. People talk about team as when the proverbial hits the fan and they go, but my team member can't get me out because we're 80 meters down, or whatever that is, 240 feet, whatever. You're a long way down. My team member can't help me. Metric. My team member can't help me, so I'm going to dive solo because the risks are too great. But actually, the team member helps you stop yourself from getting into that situation because they can spot whether or not the HUD's flashing the wrong color. You haven't done stuff. You can look at that. That's where team has its benefit. It's preventing the accidents from happening. Simon was talking about this the checklist study this morning, which is brilliant. It's the first attempt at trying to do some research into checklist use in diving. And this is the study, the PADI the R-Type Type R rebreather checklists and the GUE sticker checklist that they've got for in effect, build and the final on-site checks. Now, one of the bits I kicked off a study earlier this year to look at the use of checklists in rebreather diving. And one of the big issues here is what is a checklist? So where do you think a checklist is applicable? At the build stage? At the arrive on site stage? The pre-jump stage? When people talk about checklists, they have this, all sorts of different views of what a checklist is. You look at some of the manufacturers' checklists and they go from build to jump in one go. That isn't how diving happens. And as Simon said, well, you look at the expansion levels in some of those checklists, they're way too complicated. And I'll talk about the sort of the user experience piece in a minute. But the results from the Dan piece 2 years ago, for every 25 dives that happened, they would have reduced an adverse event dive. So if you do 50 dives in a year, you may only save or have 2 saves in that whole year. It probably won't appear in your own memory of, that's a good idea. So you don't have that feedback loop, your own evidence to say it's a good idea. What came out of the study as well? Not unsurprisingly, those who did not use a checklist had the best gains when it came to stopping things from happening. But only 6.6% of subjects used a checklist prior to this study. It's not something that's normally used. Say my ongoing checklist work, I'm hoping to present at Eurotech in October this year, of what stops and what enables checklists to happen. There's 2 parts to it. One is the users. Why is it they didn't use the checklist? Did they detect anything that went wrong after they'd used a checklist? Or if they'd afterwards picked up failures because they'd now started using checklists? And around about 25% of people, even when they'd used a checklist, something had still gone wrong. So either the checklist's rubbish or they're not using them right. Because if the checklist is good, you would be able to prevent those things from happening. And the other bit is part of the analysis is looking at the checklists themselves. I looked at the top, there's about 9 rebreather units come up as the most prolific out of the more than 1,000 responses I got. And I'm going to go through those checklists and say, okay, so what do they look like? How many lines and text are in those? Do they actually have a pre-jump check? A lot of them don't. As I say, it's just this 3 sides of letter paper. Well, nobody's going to use that. Ultimately, when you look at user experience, if you don't make it easy to use, nobody's going to use it. How many rebreather instructors are in the room? Okay, probably about half. How many of you tell your students to get hold of the manufacturer's manual and write your own checklist. Okay? Is that because, well, there's quite a few less than I thought actually. If the checklist is not good enough from the manual or from the manufacturer, why is it like that? Why hasn't there been something that goes back to feed back to the manufacturer that the checklist is wrong? That it needs to have some form of standardization. Aviation checklists don't go into lots of great detail. As Simon was saying earlier, they need to have a standardization that could be, in effect, the final O2 DIL electronics. Is it holding stops or is it controlling properly? That's broadly what you need to do. You don't need to have great levels of detail. The downside of that is the training requirement goes up because your instructors now have to teach the students what the checklist actually means. And they've got to practice those behaviors and they've got to get that into the mindset. Unfortunately, checklists are not the complete solution. They're not the panacea that some people think they are, because you need to have an effective social environment to make them work. This guy here, Ken Catchpole, works at Mount Sinai Research Center in the West Coast, wrote a paper called The Problem with Checklists. To be effective, a checklist reliant on teamwork for success may fail despite all the items being followed, because those team skills were insufficient.
One thing about checklists is a checklist is a checklist. Like, it should be verified. It says it's 2 in the guide. It should be verified. I think, is that what that's talking about in a way?
It is exactly that. That you need to have a situation where I'm going to cross-check against you.
Because if I have a checklist, I can say it's all okay, but that's...
Who holds you accountable?
Yeah, exactly.
And when Simon was talking about Lynn and Bruce earlier, as sitting there and cross-checking against each other. But that means that you've got to have teamwork. You've got to have good communication skills. You've got to be able to challenge the person that's sitting next to you going, you haven't done it yet. Oh, okay. But if the instructors aren't using checklists as that role model, why would the students? You see the instructor teach the students how to use the checklist as a team. Who checks the instructor doing the checklist? Out of those rebreather instructors that put your hands up, how many times do you ask the students to check that you've done your checklist? 3. So you as an instructor are part of that team. You've got to, because a team is a group of people with a common goal. And that common goal is get out the water alive. That is your top level goal. Yes, you're on a training course, but ultimately bring the same number of people back that you took down, unless you're leaving the body at the bottom. Ultimately you've got to work together, but the communication skills, it's not something that's part of that material.
We're out here now, man. I hope you're happy.
Yeah, I'm happy.
Well, good. Now what?
Well, I just think we should have wore those on our safety vests.
Oh, come on, man. Those vests are for daggone people who really like to use them. The deer don't even see them. They're colorblind, stupid. Golly. Hey, Tiny, did you get something? Tiny, what'd you get? Tiny. Tiny, oh my God!
911, what is your emergency, please?
Yes, please help us. I think my buddy, he's dead. What do I do?
Sir, calm down. I can help you. We'll walk through this together. First, I need you to make sure he's dead.
Well, I can do that. Hold on a second. He's dead. Now what?
So when you communicate with the people you're with, make sure that the message is understood before they action it. Oops. How many people in here would consider them as themselves an engineering or a maths type background? The other side of it is who's a biologist type person. So they're the two options, okay? So engineering, maths, hands up. And a biology type person, yeah, okay. So Daz or Unilever, the soap company, had an issue in terms of trying to get the soap powder to be of a uniform size. The pellets, the little grains of soap powder, they needed to get that to be a uniform size, because then it was efficient as a soap powder when it was sold to the consumers. But they had an issue, because the way it works is they spray this liquid through into an area, it dries, and the pellets fall, and the liquid goes elsewhere. So as the engineers out there, how would you solve the problem of getting a new nozzle? How would you go about designing a new nozzle? Use your maths expertise, your engineering, find the best engineers out there who are trying to design a nozzle, and you spend a lot of time putting that together. Now, they spent ages and a lot of money putting the best model that they could do using a lot of computing power, and it didn't work. They had the same issue with the clogging and the lumps of the soap powder material. But because they worked in an environment that dealt with biology, they had a bunch of biologists there. So what they did is they took the engineer's perfect model that didn't work and made 10 copies of it, and they tweaked each one of those ever so slightly. And then they did an experiment, and they had feedback, and they went, that didn't work, that didn't work, that didn't work. Oh, that one did. Did it right. We'll pick that one and we'll refine it. And they did that 45 times. And this was the engineering solution. This was the biologist solution. There were 449 failures and one solution here. And the reason it worked is because they provided feedback in a timely manner to adjust what was going on. When we look at diving accidents, how much feedback really happens? We talked about not talking about these things. There are fortunately, very few really bad accidents that happen, but there are lots of close near misses. But we don't talk about those for the reasons we talk about, you were stupid, how could you make that? Understand that we need to get that feedback in a timely manner to be able to change our behaviors. Because we have these terms, System 1, System 2, from a guy called Kahneman. Brilliant book, I would recommend, Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's all about how we've got that reptilian brain that makes us almost fast decisions that we have no control over. And the System 2 is the logical thinking. When we're stressed, this is what we do. We make those fast decisions, but we don't necessarily think through what happens. System 3 is something that's been put together as a view of, actually, that would be the perfect situation where you could think quickly, but at the same time, slow your thinking down, make logical decisions. The example that you could use is learning to drive a car. Your first lesson, absolute nightmare. And you're having to use System 2 process to try and work out how to do it. You come up to a junction, you've got to slow down, you've got to use the indicator, or you should do. If you're in a manual shift, you've got to change and use your brakes and clutch. But if you've been driving for 20 years, you don't think about what you're doing. You're up in this automatic behaviors. But we have pressures that change our behaviors. In terms of diving, how much money you've got, how much time you've got, what's the company like you're working with, who are the people you're working and training. But this changes your behavior. In fact, take the driving example here. Speed limit, 70 miles an hour. This is the rule, the limit that you've got. How many people drive posted speed limit around here, 65 on the interstate? 70. Okay. So how fast do people drive?
80.
Okay. Why don't you drive any faster than 80? Ticket. Okay. So it's not a safety issue. It's a fear of getting caught and having something go wrong. Then you've got the illegal space, the bit where you go, well, that's really stupid, and you're pushing the boundaries, and then you end up potentially with an accident. But if you're in this space here and things don't go wrong, you carry on doing that until you get a ticket, and then you change your behaviors a bit, and you go and you start drifting. This is known as the systemic migration to boundaries. Naturally, we start moving towards risky behaviors. So in diving, you should say a checklist example. You only do it when somebody's looking, when you're being checked. This role model piece, if you want to be effective in checklist use, you have to do this all the time yourself. You have to be accountable, or you've got to keep yourself, your buddies have to keep you accountable. You need to understand what these pressures are to make you change your behavior. Because if you don't understand what those pressures are, they will just gradually push you further and further out there. So we talk about situational awareness. I had this here. We said 15 passes, there was a gorilla. There was some other stuff that happened in the scene as well. There were some plant pots, flower pots in the scene. How many plant pots? 2? 3? Michael?
Say 3.
I don't know. Phil?
Yeah, 3.
Hands up. 3? Don't remember? Okay, there's some others. How many 2? How many were there? 2? There's a hand sort of went. 1? How many saw 1 in the scene? None. This bit here now. So, yes, a rebreather. People take their lead from positions of authority. We were talking about instructors. As a student questioning their instructor for not doing something, how hard is it for you as a student looking at your instructor going, that's not right. But he's more experienced than me. He's right. I can't speak up. So as instructors, guys need to be super approachable. And you have to talk about your own failures to recognize that actually you're human and you're fallible as well. But how we make those decisions, this bit about being able to recall information, stuff that's in the time, place, it's relatively easy because you can recall it easily. This bit, as you go further back, unless it has a big significance or it's very emotional, you're unlikely to recall what happened. So when you have safe, scary moments and it's really, you're likely to be able to recall that. But how many times when you went diving, think back now, of all the good things that happened, how many of those good things stick in your memory? Probably not very many. It's only when bad things happen or really super good things you go, that's cool, I want to do that again. The way you can reinforce that is by having effective debriefs and talk about what was effective and what wasn't. Another bit of quiz for you to see how much your situational awareness is and that recall effect. I'm going to show you a clip or an excerpt from a World War II map. It's in black and white. The land is white and the water is black. So this clip here, he says, black water, white land. It's a map from World War II. I'll give you about 15-20 seconds or so just to think about this a bit more. And I'm going to ask some people where they think this is in the world. Just to make a bit more pressure, nobody's got it right yet. Okay, you shout out, where do you think this is from? From the floor. Okay. Anywhere else?
France.
Okay. Oh, I was going to say that's the other thing. So the relevance there. Normandy?
Looks like there's a bridge somewhere.
Okay.
Pontoon.
Now, what if I said it was a cow? There's the nose of the cow. There's the ear and the eye and the eye. And in effect, it's standing at the screen looking like this. So when Simon talked about earlier that you have a choice when you come to making decisions, we are loaded by information given to us. So if your instructor tells you something, Can everybody see the cow is the other thing now. Some people still can't, you know. So when your instructor or somebody who's more senior to you tells you something, it's really hard to question that because you frame that, you create that memory in your mind as to what's right or wrong. You believe them because there's a level of trust.
What's the trouble, Captain? I'm not happy about the port outer. She sounds a bit rough to me. Instruments check all right? Yes. The instruments say she's okay. The chief mechanic says she's okay. Young man, let me tell you something. In the air, I am responsible for this aircraft and the lives of all on board her. And neither you nor anyone else, including the chairman of the corporation, is going to induce me to take her 1 inch off the ground until I'm absolutely satisfied she's in perfect order. Do I make myself clear? You make yourself clear. I'm right and you know I am. That's why I've flown more miles than anyone else on this airfield. Of course you're right, Captain.
And I know Puzzes from the airlines will probably attest to 20, 30 years ago, that sort of commonplace. Now think about a diving environment where you've got a very strong charactered instructor who's behaving like that. What's the chance that somebody's going to question what's going on? Or if you've got a buddy who behaves like that, what's the chances that you're going to speak up and say, that's not right? And I can see some people looking across at their buddies and going, that's you, that is. So it's really difficult. You've got to create the environment where you can talk to each other as equals. In the military, I could have a colonel in the left-hand seat as the captain, and you could have a really junior lieutenant as the non-handling pilot or the co-pilot. Rank has no place on the flight deck. You are captain, co-pilot. That's it. And it happens because he might have some really useful information for this guy who's making a right pig of it. But you've got to create that culture where you can question what's going on. If you go out into a dive boat and you see somebody on the other side of the boat, complete stranger, and you look at their kit and go, let's call 911 now because that's going to end up as a mess. How easy is it to walk across the other side of the boat and go, why is that like that? It doesn't quite look right to me. It's not easy to do that because of the egos and the self-esteem that goes on in diving. That you don't want somebody to come up to you and question you, go, because you think, well, I'm an idiot. Well, no, we are all human. We all make mistakes. And recognizing that if we go with the attitude that I'm going to fail on this dive, I'm going to make a mistake on this dive, and somebody comes to me and goes, what about that? Brilliant, thank you. How did it get to be like that? And understand how it made sense. So you need to have that feedback loop that's there. Because ultimately, we don't know where the accident line is, where you fall over the edge of the cliff. And this little diagram shows that this is what you consider to be your safe behavior. If you consider, sort of 70 miles an hour from the speeding bit. But this is what you consider to be safe. A normal life is you sort of stitch this line because that's where you think the risky bit is, and you step over it and you go, oh no, I'll get back again, and you get to here. And then you get a bit further. But the problem is that once you get to here, you now reset this as your safe line. And you operate on here. The problem is that you still don't know where that is, but you've reset this. People are rubbish at spotting absolutes. There's another bit as well in a sec for you guys. We only look at little deltas. So we look at a little step, a little step, a little step, a little step. It goes bang, and you go, how did you not spot that you'd gone from there to there? But in your mind, you only went from there to there, not from there to there. And that's the issue, because do you cross that line when you make those changes? That's where teamwork, again, helps you to hold yourself accountable. But again, the communication. You need to be able to speak to your buddies and say, what are you doing? These are the rules, whatever the rules are, the framework that you're diving to. You've gone beyond that. Get back. This is how we do stuff around here. This is the pressures that you have as economic failure. This comes from a piece on patient safety. And the bits that it's too busy, the workload that happens in the health industry, and how much you can afford to spend. But there are lots of other pressures that push this towards where the failures are. And safety measures and campaigns, they keep on pushing it back into the safe area. High reliability organizations have tightly controlled setups. So you have standards, you have good effective teamwork, you've got communication skills. And because you know what the shape of it is, say an expedition, you come up with some rules. You can operate close here to where the failure boundary is. You still don't know where it is, but you know how everybody's going to behave in a certain manner. If you have loose standards, you go over here, you go here. You don't actually know what to do. And that's where, again, debriefs and feedback help. Because if you end up getting close to this and you end up with a safe, scary moment, don't look at what happened. Look at why did it make sense to behave in the manner you did, and then correct that. Now, why focus on the technical issues? We all want the shiniest bit of kit that's out there. Oh, it's brilliant, I have one of those. When we look at the work from Dan, so it's 947 fatalities that Petar and his team had put together, 33% of those, the triggers were asphyxia. It is very rare to have a total catastrophic failure of breathing equipment. So in the majority of cases, an avoidable situation. Why are people running out of gas? Because for some reason, they're not monitoring the systems properly. Now, my view is that the way that some divers are taught, you have the instructor or the guide acting as that proxy monitoring system. How much gas you got? How much gas you got? When they go diving on their own, there is an assumption that somebody else is looking out for them. And there's this bit of, you've got to take personal responsibility. Okay, but your frame of mind is that somebody else is doing for it. You've not got into the practice. Now, it's great that Paddy have now introduced this, you need to know within 20 bar what your gas is. That's a step in the right direction. That works for people who are training, who are going through training. How do we address everybody else that's trained after here? The same with the instructors. 29% were arterial gas embolisms. It's very rare that you get that odd hit. Why did those people get bent and end up dying as a consequence? Rapid ascent. Okay, why is it that people can't hold a stop? They don't necessarily understand the significance. Well, yeah, but you know, you're in a situation. The decompression algorithm guys coming up with some fantastic algorithms, but if nobody can hold a stop within 2 or 3 meters, it's almost irrelevant because it's not fitting a model that needs to be set. So you need to understand, go back a bit. And that was the point that when Dawn introduced me, if somebody says human error, that's the bit you start looking a bit more. Human error isn't an outcome. It's the point you go, why has that happened? And it can't be the organizational issue. And it's not the instruction, the equipment. And it's not the people. It's not the physiology. You need to go that way across, not in those little silos. Equipment manufacturers can come up with a brilliant bit of kit, but if the guys aren't trained to use it and competent to use it, almost again, irrelevant. So there needs to be something that goes across this and looks at the whole context of why things go wrong. In fact, on the Neil's presentation yesterday about bubbles in a space, when people got shown the bubbles in their heart, they changed their behaviors. We don't have an effective feedback mechanism, which is the point that I was saying.
So one of the things that may have not been obvious from Neil's talk was I was one of the people with grade 4, almost 5, with left heart challenge. When I tell people that story, even though there's a lot to be learned from it, most people's reaction was that I was an idiot because I must have done something to do that. But what was really interesting was my grading factors were the same on both days. The only major difference that we could determine was there was a current. Essentially my body decided to react differently, but I think that's useful information because it proves that I'm as human as anybody else.
So I have an Amplaster device that's fixed my PFO from 6 years ago, which I found out at the doing same profiles, ascended, and have an Amplaster device because I had a PFO. But I didn't know that, and it's that sort of feedback, and I had some big denial from DCS, what I think was DCS. Anyway, and it wasn't until I got back to the UK, I phoned a colleague of mine who went, oh, I think I got bent. Went down to the hospital, inject the saline solution. Oh, look, bubbles. Bollocks. And I got an 8 mil by 12 mil PFO that's now fixed. But I didn't know, and you don't know some of these things at the time. But I've got a theory that if I have a safe, me as an individual, if I have a safe, scary event, I will probably change my behaviours. If one of my close friends has a safe, scary event, my first degree of separation, I will probably change my behaviours. If it's the second degree of separation, so friends of friends, that's them. I don't have that problem. That's them. And that's the problem with the community is I don't make that sort of mistake. That's a great idea they do that course, but I don't need to do that course because I'm good. It goes right back to that Dunning-Kruger Effect right at the start. We don't know what we don't know. And we need to have that evidence to show that actually there are lots of people who don't have or don't make these mistakes. Steve?
And then there's that 80% statistic where if you're arguing with someone and you present them the data that refutes their belief, they don't believe it.
Oh yeah, the cognitive dissonance, that argument that you can't resolve some data that's given to you.
You can't argue with an idiot because they're going to blind you with their expertise.
I put a blog post together which I managed to get a phrase, unindicted co-ejaculator, into. And it was about this point that you can't agree, or you won't agree with evidence that's presented to you. And it came about because it was DNA being used to counter unsafe convictions for rape. And once somebody had spent some time in jail, they were convicted inside, and then they'd appeal because there had been DNA evidence to show that they were innocent. And the prosecution went, no, and they were fighting all the time. And the research was showing that it followed the same sort of profile. And it got to the stage where people would say, this 11-year-old girl who was raped and murdered had consensual sex 2 or 3 hours before by somebody completely different. The rapist murderer then came in, had sex, wearing a condom, killed the victim, and off they went. Really? You come up with evidence that's that blatantly wrong because it doesn't match your own perspectives. And it happens so often they came up with this term, the unindicted co-ejaculator. Findings, and there were still people who were then cleared, and they go to prosecution, and said, do you think that it was right? Do you think that they should? No, we need to re-prosecute them. What? When people are given really compelling evidence that counters their own position, they get more and more entrenched into that view. And the further you get into that rabbit hole, the harder it is to turn around, because we don't want to show that we're wrong. We have self-esteem, naturally.
Has there been any studies done on why communities, like once you get outside the immediate circle, is there an evolutionary bias or some form of bias?
It's called tribalism.
Well, there is stuff in-group, out-group effects, which talk about, and it doesn't have to be physical. It could be you wear a shirt at work. This bit about uniform has a massive impact on people judging in-group. Well, they're good because they're part of our group. They're not in our group. We hate them. They do everything wrong, and yet they still behave the same way in and out of group, but your perception of that out-group is very different. And from, I suppose, from Steve saying there, tribalism, self-protection, that you have your group of people that you're looking after, they are potentially the enemy. It goes way back. Which leads on nicely to this just culture. We need to have that. Go on, Don. Oh, that's 5 minutes, yeah. We've got to learn to live with failure, and we've got to have that feedback. Being able to walk the walk, not just talk it. That role model. I went to a diving setup about 18 months ago, and only one of the instructors there was using a checklist, a physical checklist, rebreather area. Some of the guys were using unit checklists. There was a checklist built in the handset. One of the senior guys there hadn't pre-breathed his rebreather for the second set of dives. And I went up, and quite thick-skinned, and went up and said, why didn't you pre-breathe it? Oh, I didn't need to. I pre-breathed it this morning. Okay. How do you know that nothing changed? Oh, because it was okay. And more importantly, you hold a really senior position, you're a role model. And there was a lot of defensive, yeah, okay, fair cop, I screwed up. And change their behaviors afterwards. But it takes a lot of thick skin and balls to go up to somebody and say, what are you doing? And I'm quite good at that. We need to tell stories, including the context that's there. And it's the context really important. Chatting with somebody this morning about an adverse event, and it was only a little snippet, an almost throwaway comment that went, that was your trigger to what happened. But hadn't understood. If you just collect it as numbers or facts, it wouldn't have been there. Until we do a better job of identifying those things, we will continue to have the same issues. That means we need to be able to talk about it. If it means in a confidential, anonymous manner, fine. But it needs to be captured, and then we can start doing the analysis. And the narratives are the way to do it. You know, we all make mistakes. Teamwork helps reduce that. We got here, you know, Michael's presentation, we got here because lots of other people screwed up, unfortunately. And we've learned the same way as aviation. The rules and the guidelines and processes are out there because people have crashed aircraft and died. And we've talked about that. If we don't talk about it, we're not going to understand why it made sense at the time. We know more than others do, but we know a lot less than we think we do. And this is the graph that I was talking about. Where do you think you sit? The I know nothing, beginner. I'm an expert. I know nothing. Some of you guys may have seen this online. It's a completely made up graph by a systems engineer. But because it went on social media, it went, oh, brilliant, look at this. It's true. Anecdotally, intuitively, it probably makes sense. There's no data to support this at all. But it's a graph, it's on the internet, it must be true. And that's my presentation.